Let's look at the market context for open access. First slide, please. There have been a number of formal definitions of open access over the years, but the principle is that open access makes scholarly research permanently available online to view and to read without payment and without restriction of access. But also importantly, open access allows content to be redistributed, reused, and adapted in new works. This is the spirit of open access, not only to knock down the subscription paywall so that no one is barred from reading because they can't afford a subscription, but also to allow research to have maximum impact and to be freely used and built on for the benefit of society. Next slide, please. The two main open access types that you will have heard about are gold and green. Both these versions mean that articles are free to access in some way. Gold open access content is formally published in a journal or in a book and is immediately available to everyone and reusable by everyone on publication. Green open access is a term normally used to describe the free availability of a version of an article as accepted for publication. For example, in an institutional or subject repository or on an author's website, where the final published version of the article, the version of record, might be accessible only by subscribers to that journal. Sometimes access to the green version is embargoed for a period after publication of the version of record. Most journals have green open access guidelines that clarify how versions of their published articles can be made freely available. This should also be clear in any licensing agreement that you may have signed. One quick note. Open access is often confused with free access. Subscription articles may be granted free access as part of a marketing campaign, for example, or certain article types, such as editorials, might be free. Free access is not the same as open access because there is no reuse, modifying, or sharing allowed. Also, free access might be available only for a specified period of time. Because the publication of gold open access articles is not funded by subscriptions, originally, the main means of funding open access publishing was the payment of an article processing charge, or APC, sometimes by the author, but more usually by their employer or funder. In recent years, however, most major publishers are forming agreements with institutions, whereby members of that institution can both read the content behind subscription paywalls and publish open access without paying an additional fee. These are known as transformative agreements or read and publish agreements. They vary in structure and terms, but are increasingly becoming the route by which authors can publish open access and journals can be more open. If you want to publish your research as gold open access, there are two kinds of journals to look at: fully open access journals or hybrid journals. Hybrid journals charge subscriptions for the non-open access content, but also offer the facility to publish open access, either by payment of an APC or through a transformative agreement with the author's institution. Next slide, please. For an article to be truly open access, the author has to formally allow its reuse through a license that both allows the publisher to publish the article and licenses the reader to use the article in certain ways. Most open access articles in fully gold open access and in hybrid journals are published under Creative Commons licenses. One of the principles enshrined in Creative Commons licenses is that the author or other owner of the article retains the copyright in the work. The full ownership of the intellectual property is not transferred to the publisher or anyone else. The license then sets out the terms under which others can reuse the article. I won't go into all the variations of the Creative Commons license, as that could be a whole separate presentation on its own, but here are some of the most common variations listed on this slide. Please do visit the Creative Commons website for more detail. It's important to check your funder or institutional requirements, as they may mandate one version, often the basic CC BY license, which has the fewest restrictions on reuse. Next slide, please. Now, open access articles constitute an increasingly significant chunk of journal content. In its true sense, free to read and free to reuse, as we've just been discussing, open access accounted for more than a third of journal articles last year. Let's dive into some of the numbers here briefly. In 2020, 36% of articles in academic journals were open access. The indications, according to the consultancy DeltaThink, are that this will grow to 47% in 2023, and that at some point in 2023 to 2024 will pass the 50% mark globally. 6 or 7 years ago, there was a surge in conversion of journals to hybrid status, that mixed subscription open access model that we just discussed, which drove growth in open access via those journals. But the proportion of open access that's in hybrid journals has begun to decline, according to some analyses, with most of the growth now being driven by fully open access journals, including those from major traditional publishers building their open access portfolios. Overall, open access growth continues to outstrip growth of paywalled or subscription content. Using the Dimensions Research database, the compound annual growth rate of open access articles has been 16% over the 4 years 2017 to 2020, compared with just 1% for non-open access articles, which works out at about 7% for the market as a whole. There was a temporary slump last year after a significant COVID-driven peak, but in this temporary dip, open access growth from 2020 to 21 was still 8%, compared with a small decline of non-open access content. Next slide, please. Looking at it by discipline, there are no surprises, with life and health sciences leading the way, and social sciences and arts and humanities lagging somewhat. Now, the benefits of open access to researchers and to research are the same, whatever the discipline. So probably much of what we see here is about differences in funding for publishing. So that to date, the shift from a read or subscription model to a publish or open access model has been challenging for a number of disciplines. As well as direct differences in funding, in some disciplines there are concerns about possible inequities. How do authors without access to funds publish their research open access? Transformative agreements and waiver programs for some regions or author groups are of course already mitigating that. But at this point, those concerns possibly still hinder the wholehearted endorsement of open access. Next slide, please. Let's remind ourselves about what has been driving the shift to open access. First, the funders. You may have heard of the group of largely European funders known as Coalition S, who've been mandating open access for their grant recipients and setting out in their Plan S their requirements for how journals should comply with open access principles. Although for some journals, the proportion of content represented by this group of funders is relatively small, there is no doubt that Plan S has accelerated the transition, not just because of the threats of withdrawing funding for non-compliant publications, but because their principles and many of their requirements do make sense, which has forced a rethink about what good research and publishing practice should look like. Then there is institutional support. This has been partly driven by budgets, with an expectation that with open access, spend will be much more closely tied to something measurable, amount and use of content published, than historic subscription prices. But it's not just about money, with library websites acknowledging and indeed extolling the benefits of open access, and a number of institutions proactively stating their support for open research. For example, the University of California's statement back in 2017 on commitment to free and open information, scholarship and knowledge exchange, and the MIT Task Force recommendations of 2019, which included a recommendation to add an open access requirement to research grant programs. Publishers too have stepped up to support funders and institutions, particularly with those transformative or read and publish sales models that I mentioned earlier, but also a number of policy and workflow changes in response to both funder mandates and research community calls for change. But finally, and most importantly, there is the recognition of the fundamental benefits of open research. That these are universally acknowledged was illustrated by publishing during the COVID pandemic. There was an unquestioned expectation that access to potentially impactful content should be seamless and without barriers, with a swift response from publishers. And the UNESCO Declaration of November 2021 robustly acknowledged the benefits to scholarship and to society of open research, and called on institutions, publishers, funders and governments to put the necessary support and principles in place. Now over to Daniel.